2 American soldiers are dead. A third is missing. And in the last 48 hours, the United States military has hit back at the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps with a level of force this war has not seen in months. This is the story of how a single attack on a base in Jordan pulled the United States and Iran even closer to the edge of a war neither side has been able to stop for almost 5 months. It happened on Friday, July 17th. An Iranian ballistic missile and drone attack struck a base used by American forces at Al-Azraq in Jordan. 2 U.S. service members were killed defending the base. A third is still listed as missing. 4 others were hurt badly enough to be evacuated to hospitals in Jordan, though all 4 have since been discharged. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed responsibility within hours, saying it had, in its own words, completely destroyed several aircraft at the site. These are not the first American deaths in this war. According to the U.S. military's own casualty tracking system, 16 American service members have now died since the conflict began nearly 5 months ago. 6 of those were Army Reserve soldiers killed back in March, when an Iranian strike hit a makeshift operations center at Kuwait's Shuaibah port. Friday's attack in Jordan brought the first new American combat deaths since March, and it triggered an immediate response from Washington. By Saturday evening, U.S. Central Command confirmed that American forces had launched new airstrikes against Iran at the direction of President Trump, with one stated goal: to punish the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps for the attack that killed those 2 soldiers. This was not a single strike. It was the continuation of a campaign that, by Sunday, had reached its 8th consecutive night of U.S. airstrikes on Iranian territory. To understand how serious this has become, you need to understand what the U.S. has actually been hitting. This is not just about symbolic retaliation. Central Command has confirmed strikes on power plants, on bridges, on electrical facilities, on roads and railways inside Iran. On Saturday, that included a strike on a surveillance tower at the Chabahar Shahid Kalantari port, a facility CENTCOM says Iran was using to track and target commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. On Tuesday, the campaign extended further, with the U.S. military saying it struck targets across Iran for 5 hours straight, including damage to a power plant on Iran's Kish Island. The stated logic behind this campaign is straightforward. President Trump has threatened to target Iran's power stations and bridges, specifically to force Tehran to loosen its grip on the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that Iran has repeatedly closed and reopened as a pressure tactic during this war. The United States has also reimposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports, aimed at cutting off Iran's ability to export crude oil. But Iran has not been absorbing these strikes quietly. Every American strike has been met with an Iranian one. And what makes this moment different is how wide Iran has spread its retaliation. This is no longer a conflict contained to Iran and the United States. It has become a regional war, touching nearly every American partner in the Gulf. Look at what happened just in the days before and after the Jordan attack. Iran struck U.S.-linked facilities in Bahrain and Kuwait. It targeted power and desalination plants in Kuwait, threatening basic services in a small, oil-rich nation that depends on desalinated water to survive. It struck Jordan directly, not just once, but repeatedly, with missile alerts sounding as far away as Saudi Arabia. Iraq's Kurdistan region came under drone attack as well, with a Kurdish-Iranian opposition group reporting that at least 8 of its own fighters were killed. Iran has also claimed strikes on assets in Oman, Qatar, and Syria. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has been explicit about its intentions. In a statement, the IRGC said it struck 85 separate U.S. military targets across Bahrain and Kuwait in what it called an initial response to what it termed American aggression against Iranian territory. 85 targets, not a handful, not a warning shot. A wide, deliberate barrage aimed at U.S. Fifth Fleet facilities in Bahrain and at Ali al-Salem Air Base in Kuwait. The IRGC also claimed it shot down an American MQ-9 Reaper drone over Bushehr province during that exchange. And there is a psychological dimension to this that matters just as much as the military one. Mohsen Rezaei, a senior IRGC official and military advisor to Iran's supreme leader, issued a direct warning during the same stretch of fighting. He said that if American attacks continued for 2 or 3 more days, Iran would move into what he called a full-scale offensive. His words, reported by Iranian state broadcaster IREB, were blunt. No political border will be secure against Iran's offensive forces. That is not the language of a country looking to de-escalate. That is the language of a country signaling it is prepared to widen this war even further. So why did an interim deal fail to hold? Reporting from the ground makes clear that a ceasefire framework, an interim understanding that had briefly slowed the fighting, has now collapsed. The breakdown of that agreement is what set the stage for this latest and most dangerous phase, 7 planned nights of U.S. strikes that ended on Friday, followed almost immediately by new nights of strikes triggered by the Jordan attack. In other words, the United States had just wound down one bombing campaign when a new one began within hours, because Iran did not stand down. It escalated. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of almost everything happening right now. Iran has closed it, reopened it under a memorandum of understanding with the United States. And then, according to reporting from Al Jazeera, Iran began interpreting a key clause of that same memorandum as giving it the authority to manage and restrict traffic through the waterway on its own terms. Tehran used that interpretation to justify striking 3 commercial vessels near Oman, including a Qatari liquefied natural gas tanker, accusing the ships of trying to pass through without Iranian permission. When President Trump declared that memorandum over, and the IRGC announced days later that the strait was closed once again, that was the trigger for the current wave of American strikes on Iran's coastal military infrastructure, the strikes aimed specifically at restoring freedom of navigation for global shipping. This is the part that should concern anyone watching global energy markets. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical choke points for oil shipping on the planet. When Iran closes it, or threatens to, tanker traffic slows to what reporting has described as a trickle. Every Gulf Arab state has now felt the consequences of this standoff in one form or another. Every one, that is, except the United Arab Emirates, which, as of the latest reporting, had not yet been directly targeted, though Iran's semi-official Fars news agency has already published a list of ports in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar that it says could become targets if Iranian infrastructure is hit again. That list is widely believed to be a warning aimed just as much at the UAE as at the countries actually named. Now here is the part that connects all of this back to the American public directly. The U.S. State Department has issued a global alert to American citizens, warning that they could be targeted by Iran and by groups aligned with Iran anywhere in the world, not just in the Middle East. That is not a routine travel advisory. That is the State Department telling Americans abroad that this conflict has expanded past a regional military exchange into something with global reach. And on the ground in the Gulf, the picture is one of a region bracing for what comes next. Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan all activated air defense systems over the weekend. Israel's military said it detected a missile launch aimed at Jordan's Red Sea city of Aqaba and warned its own residents that falling debris could reach Israeli territory. The U.S. Embassy in Jordan issued an urgent warning to American citizens to avoid Aqaba's airport and seaport, citing what it called a specific and credible threat. Jordan's Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Radar System, the THAAD system, meant to intercept exactly these kinds of missiles, had to be replaced earlier this year after it was damaged in an earlier round of Iranian strikes. Every side in this conflict is now operating on a hair trigger. Iranian officials have framed the entire exchange as a cycle that will not stop escalating. As one senior figure close to Tehran put it, every U.S. escalation is met with an Iranian escalation as both sides try to establish new lines of deterrence with each exchange. That is, in plain terms, an admission that neither side currently sees a path to backing down first. So where does this leave the American military response that started with those 2 deaths in Jordan? As of the most recent reporting, the United States has completed its 8th consecutive night of strikes against Iran, hitting tunnels, roads, bridges, and railways, according to Iranian state media, alongside the military and coastal targets already mentioned. Central Command has said explicitly that this campaign is designed to degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz and to punish the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps specifically for the attack that killed American troops in Jordan. What this campaign has not done, at least based on what has been confirmed so far, is eliminate the Guard's ability to strike back. Iran continued launching new attacks on U.S. allies throughout this same stretch of fighting, hitting Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan again in the hours after the American retaliatory strikes began. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath the headlines. This is not a one-sided campaign where American strikes go unanswered. It is a war of exchanges, each side absorbing losses and hitting back within hours, sometimes within the same day. For the families of the 2 soldiers killed in Jordan, and for the families still waiting on news of the missing service member, none of the strategic framing changes what happened on Friday. 2 more names will be added to a list that has grown to 16 American service members lost in this war since it began. The question now is whether the current round of American strikes on IRGC-linked targets changes Iran's calculus, or whether, as Iranian officials have already warned, this simply becomes the next escalation in a cycle that has shown no sign of slowing for almost 5 months. What happens in the coming days will likely depend on 2 things. First, whether Iran follows through on threats of what its own officials have called a full-scale offensive if American strikes continue. Second, whether the Strait of Hormuz, the actual center of gravity in this entire standoff, stays closed, reopens, or becomes the site of a direct confrontation between American and Iranian naval forces. Global oil markets, Gulf economies, and the safety of American citizens, both in the region and abroad, are all now tied to how those 2 questions get answered. This is where things stand right now, as of today. A dead ceasefire framework, 8 straight nights of American strikes, 16 American service members lost since the war began. a region-wide exchange of fire touching Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, Oman, Iraq, and Syria, and a warning from a senior Iranian military official that the next 2 or 3 days could determine whether this becomes something far larger than what it already is. To understand how we even got to a 5th month of open war between the United States and Iran, it helps to go back to how this conflict actually started. Iran's supreme leader at the time, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in a joint US and Israeli strike back in February. That single event reshaped the entire power structure inside Iran almost overnight, and it set the tone for everything that has followed. This is not a limited skirmish over a single incident. It is a war that began with the killing of Iran's top leader and has been grinding forward for nearly half a year since. Mojtaba Khamenei has since stepped into the position of supreme leader, and it is under his authority that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has continued this campaign of retaliatory strikes across the region. That history matters because it explains why Iran has been unwilling to simply absorb American strikes and stand down. From Tehran's perspective, this war did not start with a shipping dispute in the Strait of Hormuz. It started with the death of the man at the top of the Iranian state. Every strike since has been framed inside Iran, at least publicly, as a continuation of resistance against that original act, not as an isolated skirmish that can be negotiated away with a single ceasefire. The interim deal that briefly slowed this war down is worth spending a moment on because its collapse is really the hinge point for everything happening this week. That earlier memorandum of understanding was supposed to stabilize shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most sensitive flashpoints in the entire conflict. For a period, it appeared to be holding. Then, Iran began interpreting one clause of that agreement as giving it unilateral authority to police which ships could pass through the strait and which could not. When Iran used that interpretation to justify boarding and striking commercial vessels, including a Qatari LNG tanker, the deal effectively became meaningless in practice even before either side formally declared it dead. President Trump's declaration that the memorandum was over on Wednesday was simply the public confirmation of something that had already fallen apart in the water. It is also worth being precise about the blockade, because it is doing a lot of quiet work in this conflict that does not always make headlines. The U.S. Navy's reimposed blockade on Iranian ports is designed to choke off Iran's ability to export crude oil, which remains one of the Iranian government's primary sources of revenue for funding its military operations, including the Revolutionary Guard Corps itself. Every barrel of oil that cannot leave an Iranian port is a barrel of revenue Tehran does not have. That is the economic front of this war, running in parallel with the missile and drone exchanges, and it is part of why Iran has treated freedom of movement through Hormuz as something worth fighting over directly, rather than simply accepting American naval pressure. On the ground inside Iran itself, the human and infrastructure cost of this campaign has been significant. Reporting and imagery from Hormozgan province in southern Iran show the scale of what American strikes have targeted along the coast, including bridges that have been left destroyed, with vehicles overturned amid the wreckage. These are not abstract military targets on a map. They are pieces of everyday infrastructure, the same roads and bridges that Iranian civilians use, now folded into a broader campaign meant to cut off Iran's military logistics and its ability to threaten shipping lanes. Inside Iran, the government has continued to lean heavily on its own public messaging around resistance and sacrifice. State media imagery from Tehran in recent days has shown scenes built around the legacy of figures like Qasem Soleimani, the former Quds Force commander, invoked repeatedly as a symbol of defiance against American and Israeli pressure. That kind of messaging is not incidental. It is part of how the Iranian government keeps its domestic population aligned with an increasingly costly war, one that has now stretched past the point most analysts expected it to end. Let's talk about the missile technology Iran used in the Jordan attack specifically, because it tells you something important about how this war has changed since it began. Reporting indicates Iran used some of its most advanced ballistic missiles in Friday's strike, and that Jordan, unlike its Gulf neighbors who have spent years and billions of dollars building layered air defense networks, was comparatively less prepared to intercept an attack of that scale. That gap in preparedness is part of why the attack was able to kill American personnel, rather than simply being intercepted and absorbed the way many earlier Iranian strikes on Gulf states have been. Compare that to what happened over Jordan again just one day later on Sunday, when the U.S. Embassy in Jordan issued its urgent warning about a specific and credible threat to Aqaba. This time, Jordanian and Israeli air defenses were on high alert well before any missile crossed into range. Jordan's military reported that it intercepted the large majority of incoming projectiles during an earlier wave of attacks in this same stretch of fighting, with debris from intercepted weapons causing only minor injuries and limited damage on the ground. The difference between Friday's deadly attack and Sunday's successfully intercepted one may come down to exactly this kind of preparation, and it is a difference that is now costing lives when it fails. There's also a broader pattern worth naming here, because it goes beyond Iran acting alone. During the same period of fighting, an Iraqi militia group calling itself Saraya Awliya al-Dam claimed responsibility for a separate drone attack targeting Jordan, stating explicitly that the strike was carried out in support of Iran's war effort. That is a signal that this conflict is no longer just a two-country exchange between Washington and Tehran. It has pulled in Iran-aligned militia networks across Iraq and Syria, groups that are choosing, on their own initiative, to open new fronts against American allies as a way of supporting Iran's broader campaign. So what should you actually be watching for in the days immediately ahead? 3 things. First, whether the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps follows through on the warning from senior official Mohsen Rezaei that continued American strikes will trigger what he called a full-scale offensive, language that suggests Iran believes it still has significant undeployed military capacity it has not yet used in this war. Second, whether the United Arab Emirates, so far the one major Gulf state that has not been directly struck, becomes the next target now that Iran's Fars news agency has publicly named it, alongside Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar as a potential target. Third, and most consequential for the global economy, whether the Strait of Hormuz stays functionally closed to normal shipping traffic, because every week it remains restricted adds pressure to global oil prices and tightens the economic vice on every country that depends on that waterway, allies and adversaries alike. None of these questions have clean answers yet. What is certain is that the killing of 2 American soldiers in Jordan on Friday was not treated by Washington as an isolated incident to be absorbed quietly. It was treated as the specific trigger for a new and intensified round of American strikes on Iranian territory, aimed directly at the Revolutionary Guard Corps units and infrastructure believed responsible. Whether that response changes Iran's behavior or simply becomes the next entry in a 5-month cycle of strike and counterstrike is the question this war will answer in the days immediately ahead. It is also worth stepping back and asking what this means for the countries caught in between, the ones that did not choose this war but are absorbing its costs anyway. Jordan is a U.S. treaty partner, not a combatant by choice, and it has now had American troops killed on its soil while its own civilians take shelter from missile debris in cities like Azraq. Kuwait is watching its power and desalination infrastructure come under direct attack, in a country where desalinated water is not a convenience but a basic requirement for daily survival. Bahrain hosts the U.S. Fifth Fleet, which makes it a permanent target by definition for as long as this war continues, regardless of what Bahrain itself wants. These are the countries whose foreign ministries have spent the last several days condemning Iran's strikes in near-identical statements, from Kuwait to Jordan to Qatar to the UAE to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and the Palestinian territories, a rare moment of near-unanimous regional alignment against Tehran's actions, even as several of those same governments try to avoid being pulled any deeper into direct combat. The economic backdrop to all of this is not a side issue. It is arguably the reason the Strait of Hormuz has become the single most fought-over piece of geography in this entire war, roughly a fifth of the world's oil, and a significant share of global liquefied natural gas moves through that strait under normal conditions. When Iran closes it, or restricts it, or strikes tankers attempting to pass through without what it calls permission, the effects are not contained to the Gulf. They show up in fuel prices and shipping insurance rates and in the calculations of every country that imports Gulf oil from Asia to Europe. That is part of why the United States has focused so much of its most recent strikes specifically on the infrastructure Iran uses to monitor and threaten that shipping lane, the surveillance towers, the coastal military sites, the naval assets tied to the blockade Iran has tried to enforce. And there is a reason this particular round of fighting feels different from earlier rounds this year. Earlier phases of this war saw pauses, brief windows where diplomacy seemed to gain traction, including the interim memorandum that briefly slowed strikes on shipping. This time, the pattern looks different. The 7-night U.S. bombing campaign that just concluded on Friday was already, by definition, an extended and sustained operation, not a single retaliatory strike. And instead of that campaign creating space for a new round of talks, it was immediately followed by the deadliest attack on American forces since March, which then triggered an 8th night of strikes with no clear indication of when or whether this cycle slows down. Iranian officials have been explicit that they see no reason to be the side that stops first. American officials have been equally explicit that the campaign is continuing until its stated objectives, protecting shipping through Hormuz and punishing the Revolutionary Guard Corps for American deaths, are met. That is the reality as it stands today. Not a war that ended with a single dramatic strike, but a war that keeps finding new reasons to continue, one retaliation at a time, with American troops, Iranian infrastructure, and an entire region of civilians caught in between.